I never believed in grand romantic gestures until the day I found Mason standing in the rain outside my apartment in Seattle, soaking wet, with two suitcases and that crooked smile I'd been trying to forget for 3 months. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this really began, back in Austin, on a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday until it didn't. I was running late to the marketing meeting, coffee in one hand, laptop bag sliding off my shoulder, when I literally collided with someone in the hallway. My coffee went everywhere, mostly on him, and I was already apologizing before I even looked up. When I did, I forgot how to form words for a solid 3 seconds. He had these warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and he was smiling at me despite being covered in my mediocre office coffee. I'm Dylan, by the way. 28, perpetually anxious about being late, and apparently incapable of walking and carrying beverages simultaneously. And this was Mason, though I didn't know his name yet. I just knew that my heart was doing something weird in my chest, and I couldn't tell if it was embarrassment or something else entirely. He laughed it off. Actually laughed. While I was frantically grabbing napkins from the break room and making everything worse by trying to dab at his shirt, he gently took the napkins from my hands and said, "First day jitters, huh?" I realized he must be the new hire everyone had been talking about, the creative director from New York who was supposed to revolutionize our campaigns or something. Great. I'd just assaulted our department's golden boy with lukewarm coffee. I tried to explain that no, I'd worked there for 3 years, I was just chronically clumsy, but he was already introducing himself, extending his hand like we were meeting at a networking event instead of in the aftermath of my personal disaster. Mason Rivera. And you are? His hand was warm and his grip was firm, and I held on maybe a second too long before stammering out my name. We ended up walking to the conference room together, and he asked me questions about the company, about Austin, about where to get good tacos. Normal questions. But the way he looked at me when I answered, like he was genuinely interested in my opinion on breakfast tacos, made my stomach flip. I told myself it was just because he was new and friendly and objectively attractive. That's what you tell yourself, right? When you're not ready to examine what you're actually feeling. The meeting was torture. He sat directly across from me, and every time I tried to focus on the presentation, I'd catch him looking at me, not in a creepy way, just in this attentive way that made me hyper-aware of every gesture I made, every word I said. When I pitched my campaign idea, he nodded along, and afterward, he said he thought it was brilliant. Brilliant. No one had ever called my work brilliant before. Adequate, sure. Solid. But not brilliant. We started having lunch together. It became this unspoken thing where around noon, he'd appear at my desk with that questioning look, and I'd grab my wallet and we'd head to whatever food truck he wanted to try. He was on a mission to eat his way through Austin, and somehow I became his guide. I learned he'd left New York after a bad breakup, that he played guitar but only when no one was listening, that he was scared of birds for a reason he refused to explain. I told him things too. Things I didn't usually share. About my family back in Oregon. About how I'd always felt like I was waiting for my life to actually start. About the novel I'd been pretending to write for 5 years. It was during one of these lunches, about 6 weeks after he'd started, that I realized I was in trouble. We were sitting on a bench in Zilker Park, and he was telling some ridiculous story about his college roommate, and the sun was hitting his face in this perfect way, and he threw his head back laughing at his own punchline. My chest physically ached looking at him. Not in a bad way. In this overwhelming way where I wanted to freeze that moment forever. That's when I knew. This wasn't just friendship. This was something I'd been carefully avoiding acknowledging. The problem was I had no idea if Mason felt the same way. He'd mentioned his ex a few times, always with he pronouns, so I knew he was queer. But that didn't mean he saw me as anything other than his work friend who knew where to find the best queso. I became obsessed with reading signs that probably weren't there. The way he'd touch my shoulder when he laughed. How he always remembered my coffee order. The time he texted me at 11 p.m. to ask if I was watching the meteor shower. And when I said no, he showed up at my apartment to drag me to the roof. That night on the roof, lying on a blanket he'd brought, watching stars streak across the sky, he told me he was really glad he'd moved to Austin. He said it quietly, almost like he was talking to himself. But then he turned his head to look at me and said, "I mean it, Dylan. I'm glad I met you." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I wanted to kiss him. I wanted to tell him I felt the same way, that he'd become the best part of my day, that I thought about him constantly. Instead, I said, "I'm glad too," and hated myself for being such a coward. Things shifted after that night, became charged with something unspoken. We'd have these moments where our eyes would meet and hold, and I'd think this is it. This is when something happens. But then one of us would look away or make a joke and the moment would pass. It was exquisite torture. I started staying late at the office just to see if he'd stay late too. He always did. We'd end up in the empty break room at 8 or 9, supposedly working, but mostly just talking, sitting closer than necessary, and I'd go home and lie awake, replaying every word, every look, every accidental touch. Then came the campaign that changed everything. We got assigned to work together on a major pitch, which meant long hours collaborating, which meant more time in close quarters. We worked at his apartment one Saturday, sprawled on his couch with our laptops and scattered papers, and at some point I looked up, and he was already looking at me. We just stared at each other for what felt like an hour, but was probably 5 seconds, and the air felt thick with everything we weren't saying. I chickened out. I made some excuse about needing to check something in the kitchen, and I left the room just to breathe. When I came back, he'd gone back to his laptop, and we didn't mention it. We finished the campaign. We nailed the pitch. Our boss praised our chemistry, said we made a great team, and Mason smiled at me across the conference table like we shared a secret. Maybe we did. The next Friday, the team went out for drinks to celebrate. I'm not much of a drinker, but I was nervous and kept accepting refills. Mason stayed close to me all night, his arm occasionally brushing mine at the bar, and when someone suggested karaoke, he leaned in close to my ear and said, "Please don't make me do this alone." So we ended up on stage, sharing a microphone, murdering some 80s duet I barely knew. And he was laughing, and I was laughing, and his face was inches from mine and everything else disappeared. Back at the bar, emboldened by alcohol and adrenaline, I almost told him. I had the words ready. But then his phone rang. It was his ex, the one from New York. I only heard Mason's side of the conversation. But I heard enough. He stepped outside to talk, and when he came back 20 minutes later, he looked shaken. He said he needed to tell me something, and my stomach dropped. We went outside, away from the noise. He told me his ex wanted to try again, had been calling for weeks. He told me he didn't know what to do because he'd thought he was over it, but now he wasn't sure. And then he said, "But there's something else. Someone else I can't stop thinking about." And he looked at me in a way that made my breath catch. "Dylan, I need to know if I'm reading this wrong. If what I think is happening between us is just in my head." I couldn't speak. Here it was. The moment I'd been simultaneously craving and dreading, and I was frozen. He kept talking, said he'd felt this connection from the day we met, that every lunch and late night and stupid inside joke had made him fall for me more. And he needed to know if I felt it too, because if not, he'd back off. But if I did, then his ex-calling didn't matter, because I was the person he wanted. I finally found my voice and told him yes. Yes, I felt it. Yes, I'd been falling for him for months. Yes, this was real. And then he kissed me. Right there on the sidewalk, with our co-workers probably watching through the bar windows. And it was nothing like I'd imagined, and better than I'd imagined all at once. His hands cupped my face, and mine grabbed his shirt, and it felt like everything clicking into place. We were inseparable after that. Officially together, though we kept it quiet at work for a while. Those first few weeks were intoxicating. Every moment felt significant, charged with the electricity of newness. We'd have dinner at his place or mine, and I'd watch him cook while he told me about his day. And I'd think, this is what I've been waiting for. This feeling. This person. He'd stay over most nights, and I'd wake up to him already awake, watching me with this soft expression that made me want to hide and never leave all at once. 3 months in, I got the offer. A job in Seattle, a huge opportunity, the kind of career move I couldn't turn down. I was excited until I realized what it meant. I'd have to leave Austin, leave Mason. We'd been together for such a short time, and long distance seemed impossible. But this job was everything I'd been working toward. I didn't know how to tell him. When I finally did, over dinner at my apartment, he went quiet. He asked questions about the role, the company, the city, and I answered, trying to gauge his reaction. Then he asked when I'd have to leave. 6 weeks, I said. He nodded slowly, then said, "That's not much time." I waited for him to ask me not to go, or to say we'd make it work. But he just reached across the table and took my hand and said, "We'll figure it out." We didn't figure it out. We spent the next 6 weeks in this strange limbo, not quite breaking up, but not making plans either. We didn't talk about what would happen when I left. We just existed in the present, making the most of every moment while this expiration date loomed over us. It felt like slowly suffocating. I loved him. I'd realized I loved him. But I couldn't ask him to wait for me or to come with me. We'd only been together a few months. That would be crazy. My last night in Austin, we stayed up all night at his apartment. We didn't sleep, just talked and held each other, and pretended morning wouldn't come. When the sun started rising, he walked me to my car, which was packed with everything I owned. We stood there on the street, and I was crying even though I'd promised myself I wouldn't. He wiped my tears and said, "You're going to be amazing in Seattle. You're going to do incredible things." And I wanted to scream that I didn't care about incredible things if it meant losing him. Instead, I said I'd call him when I got there. He said he'd like that. We kissed goodbye, and I got in my car and drove away, watching him get smaller in my rearview mirror until he disappeared. I cried for the first 300 miles. Seattle was everything I'd hoped for professionally and everything I'd feared personally. The job was challenging and rewarding. My apartment was small, but had a view of the water, and I was desperately, achingly lonely. Mason and I texted every day at first, then every few days, then weekly. Our phone calls became shorter, more surface level. We were drifting, and I didn't know how to stop it. I told myself this was natural, that we'd had our moment and now it was over, that I needed to move on. 2 months after I'd left, he stopped responding as frequently. When we did talk, he seemed distracted. I convinced myself he'd met someone else, that he was letting me down easy. I stopped reaching out as much. By month 3, we were basically strangers who occasionally liked each other's social media posts. It hurt worse than the initial goodbye. At least then we'd had closure. This was just a slow fade, and I hated it. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Saturday in November, one of those grey Seattle days where the rain never quite stops. I was in my apartment, supposedly working on a presentation, but actually wallowing in self-pity, when my buzzer rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I answered, the voice on the other end said, "Hey, it's me. Can you let me up?" My brain short-circuited. I knew that voice. I pressed the button to unlock the door without even processing what was happening. Then I was standing in my doorway, watching the elevator numbers climb, my heart racing. And when the doors opened, there he was. Mason, in Seattle, soaking wet from the rain, dragging 2 suitcases, looking nervous and hopeful and absolutely insane. I just stared at him. He walked down the hallway toward me and said, "I know I should have called, but I was afraid you'd tell me not to come." I found my voice enough to ask what he was doing here, and he said, "You told me once, back in Austin, that you'd always felt like you were waiting for your life to actually start. I feel like that too. I've felt like that my whole life. Until I met you. You're when my life started, Dylan. And when you left, I tried to pretend I could go back to how things were before. But I can't. I don't want to." He was rambling, words spilling out like he'd been holding them in for months. He told me he'd quit his job in Austin, that he'd been applying to agencies in Seattle for weeks, that he'd gotten an offer and accepted it before he'd let himself overthink it. He said he knew it was crazy, that we'd only been together a few months before I left, that I might have moved on, but he had to try. He said, "You told me you'd always wanted to live in the Pacific Northwest, and I said I'd follow you anywhere, and you laughed like I was joking. But I wasn't. I meant it. So here I am." I was crying again, but this time from something that felt like joy mixed with disbelief. I asked if he was serious, if he'd really upended his entire life to come to Seattle, and he said, "I upended my life to come to you. Seattle's just where you happen to be." Then he asked the question I could see he was terrified to hear the answer to. "Is that okay? Do you want me here?" I didn't answer with words. I closed the distance between us and kissed him. Really kissed him. For the first time in 3 months. He dropped his suitcase handles and pulled me closer. And we stood there in my hallway, both of us crying and laughing and holding on like we'd never let go again. When we finally broke apart, I pulled him inside, and he looked around my tiny apartment like he was memorizing it. We talked for hours. I made him coffee and gave him dry clothes, and we sat on my couch while he told me everything. How miserable he'd been without me. How he'd realized that a good job and a nice apartment meant nothing if he couldn't share it with the person he loved. How he'd been terrified I'd reject him, but more terrified of not trying. I told him about my miserable months too, about how I'd convinced myself he'd moved on, about how I'd been too scared to fight for us because I didn't think I had the right to ask him to change his life for me. He took my face in his hands, the same way he had the night of our first kiss, and said, "You didn't have to ask. I wanted to. I want to build a life with you, Dylan, wherever that is." I told him I loved him. I'd never said it before. I'd been too afraid. But now it seemed ridiculous that I'd ever held it back. He said it back. Said he'd loved me for months. Probably from that first day when I'd spilled coffee all over him and looked at him like the world was ending. That was 8 months ago. Mason's been in Seattle ever since. We got a bigger apartment together, one with space for both of us and his guitar that he finally plays in front of me. We've built this life that's ordinary and extraordinary all at once. We cook breakfast on Sunday mornings and argue about whether it's too rainy to go hiking and fall asleep on the couch during movies. We've met each other's families, survived our first big fight, learned how the other person needs space and closeness in different measures. Sometimes I still can't believe he came. That he loved me enough to take that leap. He says it wasn't a leap. It was the most certain thing he's ever done. I'm learning to believe in grand romantic gestures, or at least in this one. In the idea that sometimes love means showing up in the rain with 2 suitcases and a terrifying amount of hope. In the idea that the right person is worth following anywhere, even to a city where it rains 300 days a year. Last week, we were walking through Pike Place Market, and he stopped to look at the water, and I watched him taking it all in, and he caught me staring. He asked what I was thinking about, and I told him the truth. That I was thinking about the day we met, about spilled coffee and crooked smiles, and how I'd had no idea that person would become my entire world. He laughed and said he'd been thinking about the same thing, about how the best things in his life had started with accidents and bad timing and taking chances anyway. We're talking about the future now, making plans that extend past next month or next year. He wants to get a dog. I want to finally finish that novel. We both want to see where this goes, this life we're building together. It feels solid in a way I didn't know things could feel. Like I've finally stopped waiting for my life to start, because I'm living it, right now, with him. I never believed in grand romantic gestures until Mason proved me wrong. Until he showed me that love isn't just about the big moments. It's about choosing someone every day and meaning it. It's about showing up, even when it's scary, especially when it's scary. It's about finding someone who feels like home and having the courage to follow them anywhere, even if anywhere turns out to be a rainy city 3,000 miles away from where you started. So yeah, he said he'd follow me anywhere, and I didn't think he meant it. But he did. And now I can't imagine my life any other way.